Carolina. Chicken flying everywhere around the plain. Could we ever feel much finer coming into Los Angeles?
Welcome to another episode of Perspective. Today we are going to be visiting Mound Cemetery, Racine, Wisconsin. Mound Cemetery is part time capsule, part treasure, and one of the most beautiful parks in southeastern Wisconsin. Today, Margot Drummond, local historian, author, and Cemetery Commission board member, will be helping us scratch the surface of this amazing place. Also joining us today will be Cemetery Supervisor Stephen Bedard.
Our cemetery is a history book. A lot of stories to tell, a lot of stories that happened in days past. And I get a chance to go through all of the records that we have here at Mound Cemetery. And recently, one of the records came to my attention was of a circus that came to town in the late 1800s. And an elephant got loose at that circus and killed one of the circus workers. That circus worker is buried here, and in his death record it says, killed by elephant. A continuing story, though, is that for years afterwards, when the circus would return to the city, they would always come to Mound Cemetery and do some of their circus acts in memory of this man.
We cannot tell all of the stories in this program, nor can we explore the secrets behind the stories. Mound Cemetery has been serving Racine for over 150 years and is the final resting place for many of the most notable people in Racine's history.
Mound Cemetery has a lot of famous people buried here. Philo Hoy, J.I. Case, the founder Gilbert Knapp, and 37 of its mayors are buried here. But everybody that's buried here really is important to us here at Mound and Grayson cemeteries.
These hallowed grounds are the final repose for military veterans from the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and the Revolutionary War.
Behind me here we have Lot Search, one of 3 Revolutionary War soldiers that are buried here. Lot Search was 14 years old when the Declaration of Independence was signed and actually saw George Washington, who he said was a stern man with wispy red hair. He came to Racine in his later years and lived here for about 8 years before passing away.
This is the grave site of Lot Search. And Lot Search fought in the Continental Line in the Revolutionary War. He was also one of the Green Mountain Boys. And he came to Racine when he was close to 80. We really don't know too much about him, other than the fact that he was very proud of his Revolutionary War service. And I mentioned before, there are 3 Revolutionary War soldiers buried here, possibly a 4th. And the other 2 are Elijah Raymond and Rufus Carver. The history of Racine County shows that there are 14 Revolutionary War soldiers buried in Racine County, more than any other county in the state.
Margot is, I believe, a charter member of Preservation Racine. She taught for a long time at Park High School and was dearly loved by her students. She is the author of the Walking Tour of Mound Cemetery booklet, a book on death and dying, as well as her newest publication, Here's to Your Health, a book about the Horlick family. And I did borrow my sister Sharon's copy. It is a wonderful read.
Good morning. I'm joined by Margot Drummond this morning, and we are at the gorgeous Mound Cemetery. Now, Margot gives walking tours of the cemetery, and as we go through the interview, we will splice in some of the specifics that we have. Margot, thank you very much for taking time to talk to us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Now, this is a gorgeous facility. It's really like an archaeological dig here.
It is. The history of Racine is within these 58 acres.
And now who owns this?
The cemetery belongs to the city of Racine. The city owns both Mound Cemetery and Graceland Cemetery, which also has a rich history. And the cemeteries are operated by the Parks and Recreation Department. There's also a cemetery commission appointed by the mayor. There are 4 members from the public and 1 alderperson that serve on the cemetery commission.
Now, how usual or unusual is that?
It's rather unusual that a city would own cemeteries, but these cemeteries, Mound Cemetery goes back to 1852, and Graceland was purchased and developed in the early 1900s, right at the turn of the century. And at that time, the city, I felt that that was appropriate for them to provide a burial place for the loved ones of the citizens of this city.
Because of the Native Americans being buried here, the cemetery is estimated to be about 1,000 years old. The city started to bury its citizens here in 1852. A common notion is that the cemetery is full, and that just simply is not true. We do have grave spaces available, and recently the City of Racine Cemetery Commission has undertaken a project whereas we plan to build more crypts and niches down around a reflection pool in the front of the cemetery. We hope to get this underway in the next year or 2.
Now, as I told you, up until a year ago, I really didn't know that Mound Cemetery was here. When I went by on Washington Avenue, I was just fighting for my life in the 3.5 lanes of traffic that they call 4 lanes there. Do you find that a common experience?
I find it a common experience that people don't know where Mound Cemetery is. It is located on West Boulevard between Washington Avenue and Kinsey Avenue. What I find even more common is that people don't know how it got its name. They don't realize that there are 14 Native American burial mounds within the confines of the cemetery.
Now that to me is really an amazing thing, because you think that, say, 1,000 years, 2,000 years ago that the Native Americans were here building mounds. We're talking about the time of Christ.
Yes, and the thing is that these mounds were all built by hand. They are man-made. So they are clearly the oldest man-made artifacts in this area. Something that a lot of people don't know is that the cemetery got its name because of the fact that there are 14 Native American burial mounds within the confines of the cemetery. There's one behind me, and they are, if you look, scattered all around. These Native American burial mounds were made by people called woodland mound builders, and they came here probably 3,000 years ago, and somewhere within that period, maybe 1,000 years ago, began burying their dead this way, although it may have been much earlier. There's no written documentation, so it's very difficult to know. What they would do is put the body of the dead person up in a tree, and they would wait until there was just a skeleton left. And then they would dig down about 3 feet, some of these are about 50 feet in circumference, and they would place the skeleton in a sitting position facing east toward the sun. Some of the mounds were excavated by Dr. Hoy and Dr. Lapham of Milwaukee, and what they found in the mounds were anywhere from 2 to 8 individual skeletons. They did not find many artifacts. There was only one that had artifacts, and those were 2 shards of pottery, one that Dr. Hoy described as being of a Burmese style, and another one a piece of cream-colored pottery. Now, there are so many remarkable things about these mounds, but most of all, the fact that they have lasted this long. They are entirely man-made. And whatever kind of structure they put over the opening that was woven out of sticks and other things that they could find around to use, matting, it is held.
The woodland mound builders that lived near Racine demonstrated their respect and reverence for the indigenous animals by building mounds in the shape of those animals. Dr. Philo Hoy counted 125 animal-shaped and conical mounds scattered along the high ground near the Root River. Of those 125 mounds, the only ones remaining are the 14 conical burial mounds at Mound Cemetery.
Now, who was buried in the mounds, we're not certain. If they were the elders, if they were the most important people, we're not sure. The other thing that these mound builders built in the form of mounds were what are called effigy mounds in the shapes of animals and birds. And one of the largest ones was a panther that was down in Washington Park where the golf course is. And they worshipped these. They were animists. And that panther had a tail that was 30 feet long, just to give you an idea of the size of it. And when I taught at Park, I used to tell my students that that's how we got the mascot, the Park Panthers. That's just a story. There's no verification, but they like that. Unfortunately, the mounds that were there and many that were scattered all along the Root River were either dug up by farmers or curiosity seekers or simply because they were in the way. So we're extremely fortunate that these mounds are preserved.
Well, now, if they were doing Mound Cemetery today and they found the Indian burial mounds here, there would be a different kind of controversy. It would be about disturbing the remains of the Native Americans. But back in those days, there was a different kind of controversy.
Absolutely. The thing that Dr. Hoy had to go up against was that a number of people in the community felt that you could not bury heathens and Christians. Well, they referred to the Indians as heathens. The Indians did have their own religion, but they did not think it was appropriate for them to be buried side by side. Luckily, Dr. Hoy prevailed. He convinced the citizenry that these were archaeological treasures and that any burial is sacred and should not be disturbed, that their loved ones were just as dear to them when they were buried as the other people who are buried here. So we have to thank Dr. Hoy for a great deal. He also cataloged all the trees and shrubs in the cemetery, of which he said there were over 150 varieties.
Do some of those records remain?
Yes, and there's another local historian, Eugene Walter Leach, who wrote about Mound Cemetery, and he used Dr. Hoy's papers, and he also took Mr. Fancher, who had a large nursery in this area. Together they walked the cemetery and found many of those trees and shrubs.
There also were effigy mounds in the shapes of lizards and panthers, probably used for religious worship. So as you pass through the rest of this cemetery, remember, this was sacred ground for my Native American ancestors. Thank you.
Imagine all the people living for today.
One of the things that I do find interesting about Mound Cemetery, since the Native Americans are buried here, is that originally when Dr. Philo Hoy wanted to use this as a cemetery, the town people did not want to use this. They did not want to be buried by heathens, as it was. And here we are 150 years later, and everybody is buried together as one peoples. And it's such an interesting place to be. It's one of the most beautiful parks that I could really think of in the city of Racine. We have lots of wildlife in here, deer, raccoon, the occasional fox and coyote. It's just so wonderful how people of all nationalities have come together and are equalized by death in itself. This is a place where families come to be reunited.
In 1852, what was the city of Racine like?
Well, the city was pretty much centered on the downtown area, College Avenue, Park Avenue, Wisconsin and Maine. Many of the large homes of the wealthier people were in that area. And then on the side streets, such as Wisconsin Avenue, people who maybe worked in those homes would have a smaller place to live. The industries were scattered out around State Street. On the north side, there was, across the river, there was what was called Sagetown. And that was developed by the Sage family. Sidney Sage was, I believe, a judge in the area. They had come here as very early settlers, along with Knapp and Hubbard, and there was a Hulbert family. say that right, Holbert. So there was one doctor, Dr. Carey, and then later on Dr. Philo Hoy. Marshall M. Strong was the first attorney in Racine. The first white woman to come to Racine was Gilbert Knapp, the founder of Racine's sister, Sarah Milligan. She came because Gilbert Knapp had been widowed. Some of the women in the city ran schools for the children, so the city was just developing outward from the core of the lake and the river that provided natural resources.
Are we talking dirt roads to get here?
Oh yes, there were dirt roads, and that was one of the reasons why it was controversial to put the cemetery so far away from the downtown, because of course they just did have mud usually to go on. There were plank roads that you had, and sometimes there were toll roads that you had to pay to go on. Downtown on Monument Square, they called it Haymarket Square, and they had troughs there for the horses to get water and also to get hay. And of course it was after the Civil War that the Civil War Memorial was put up, and then it became known as Monument Square. They also had a terrible problem with water and the pollution of water from animal waste. And Dr. Meacham, who was one of the pioneers of the area too, helped them to get a good water system that was pure enough that people would not be dying from the diseases that would be carried in the water.
Margot Drummond taught for Racine Unified for 30-plus years and spent the last 20 years at Park High teaching history, government, and especially Racine history. As most of Margot's students know, Gilbert Knapp is acknowledged as the founder of Racine. Captain Knapp was a Great Lakes sea captain and was constantly on the lookout for the right place to build his town. For a short time, his town was called Port Gilbert.
And he chose Racine because of its natural beauty. It later became known as the Belle, B-E-L-L-E, City of the Great Lakes, and Belle means beautiful in French. Knapp liked the fact that the river and the lake came together. He thought it would be a great place for a harbor, and so he staked his claim. The problem with his claim was he staked it a little too early before it was actually legal to do so, but somehow he was able to work that out, and he became known as the founder of Racine. He lived to a very old age. In his later years, he lived with his daughter, Mrs. McClurg, at the home which today is the VFW on Main Street.
Now, who were the prime movers in getting Mound Cemetery?
The main person is always identified as Dr. Philo Hoy, and he was a medical doctor by training, but he was an amateur archaeologist and botanist, but when I say amateur, he was very, very knowledgeable. His papers are at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C.
Dr. Hoy was the chairman of the Cemetery Commission and had a vision that the acreage that is now Mound Cemetery would make a beautiful final resting place. However, Dr. Hoy engaged in 3 years of spirited debate to convince his fellow citizens.
Dr. Hoy was an incredible man. He was a physician by training, and he would go all around the area in his horse and buggy. And whenever he'd go out on a call to one of his patients, he'd take along his butterfly net and little pins so that he could pin insects, and which he collected. Somebody asked him once, well, why do you pay attention to such small insects? And he said, any creature that God made is worthy of attention. He thought everybody should know about Native Americans. He thought everybody should know about nature, and his own children had sort of a menagerie, including a snake that his daughter Jenny took to school once, much to the consternation of her teacher.
Dr. Hoy was fondly referred to as the red-headed woodpecker due to his red hair, his love of birds, and his continual darting around to get things done. Dr. Hoy's daughter Jenny remarked of her father, "Remember that he was born with 3 gifts: physical energy, mental hunger, and a joy of life."
One day on a Sunday, he went to Mrs. Duran's house, and he had brought her a caterpillar. And he put it on one of the columns of the house and left a little note and said, "I hope you find this caterpillar that I wanted to show you."
I want to thank you for watching part 1 of a 3-part series on Mound Cemetery. In 2004, the Cemetery Commission organized a one-day reenactment which focused on the Civil War. You saw some brief clips of that reenactment, and in part 3, you will learn more. I want to thank Joyce and Larry Gregg for videotaping the reenactments and making that footage available for this program. In part 2, Margot Drummond, Stephen Bedard, and I will talk about J.I. Case, the Horlick brothers, their mausoleums, and other aspects of the mausoleum at Mound Cemetery. Once all 3 parts of this series are completed, they'll be put together in a commemorative DVD.